Welcome to our session on leveling up your public speaking skills. My name is Chris Punongbayan. I use he, him pronouns, and I have the privilege of working for California Change Lawyers. Our mission is to build a better justice system for all Californians and to empower the next generation of legal change makers. This webinar is the third in a series that we just launched this year in 2020 to help create the conditions of success for both attorneys and law students, especially those whose experiences are shaped by their identities as first-generation, LGBT, non-binary, women, and people of color. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're living in an incredibly challenging time due to the coronavirus pandemic. It's truly surreal what's going on right now. For example, I never thought I'd be broadcasting from my dining room table into all of your homes, into your laptops. It's just a situation that we're all learning to roll with. But at the same time, we do still have control over certain aspects of our lives, and hopefully that can help us maintain some semblance of normalcy and to help us still carry on even though the times are so challenging. All of us at Change Lawyers are very grateful that you are able to join us today. And more on point to what I just mentioned, I want to invite you to a virtual meetup that we're doing next Tuesday at noon on what it means to be a social justice lawyer in the age of COVID-19. And we'll be talking about how we can continue to serve our communities while at the same time taking care of ourselves. So our format today will be a presentation right after I'm done with this intro till about 12:45 with our guest speaker, Julia Wilson. I encourage you to interact with us throughout the next hour in the chat box. If there's something that Julia says that really resonates with you, let others know. We'll also have some poll questions, so there'll be a little bit of engagement from you and we'll ask you to respond. If you do have a question for Julia, we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end. For Q&A. So please use the Q&A box for your questions so that we'll be able to see it. So to help ground the content of this webinar in real life, I just want to share a little bit about my own journey with public speaking. I actually got really excellent exposure to public speaking starting in elementary school. My elementary school had what we called a speech contest for every year. It was a K-8 school. And we all had to memorize little poems or speeches or excerpts from books. And I was really good at rote memorization. And so I got a chance not only to speak in front of my class, but then in front of the whole school in a competition. And I really got comfortable being in front of a large audience. But fast forward to 2016, I realized that I was comfortable with almost that exact type of public speaking where I memorize something and it's really just almost a cold delivery of content because I was just essentially memorizing, or I had all of my bullet points identified. What was really hard for me was sharing my personal story. And it was in 2016 when I went through public speaking training just like this one, a little bit more extensive than a 1-hour webinar, where I examined why I had hangups about sharing my personal story. And in that time, I was able to be more comfortable sharing my personal story with very large public audiences in Northern California. Some of you who are up here know KQED's Perspective series. I submitted a perspective that got selected, and it was sharing the story of my uncle who was undocumented and unable to work because of the 1986 immigration reform law that made working in the United States unlawful if you didn't have legal permission. And that was a real hard, short story to tell, and he was coming to me for advice. Because I was I was an attorney in the family. But I used the opportunity to share a very personal story to my family in order to share more broadly what the impact of the issue was, where we were lacking a human face. And so I still find it a little bit challenging to share my personal story in my public speaking, but I know that it's something that people really want to hear and helps humanize all of the difficult issues that we work on. So I'm going to transition now to introduce Julia Wilson. I first met Julia about 10 years ago when I was participating in the inaugural Executive Fellows class of One Justice, the organization that Julia led since 2007 up until last Friday. Over the course of that 8 or 9 month period, I saw Julia on a monthly basis, excuse me, and I got a chance to see how much she cared about the success of all of us as individual leaders working in legal aid nonprofits. She just brought so much compassion and skills to every session that she helped design for our cohort, and I felt like I grew as a professional because of the work that Julia has done. Julia is now a leadership coach and consultant supporting legal aid leaders and nonprofits throughout the country. Previously, as CEO of One Justice, she led the organization's award-winning work to bring life-changing legal aid to those in need by transforming California's civil legal aid system. She started her career at the Legal Aid Society of San Mateo County as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and also served as the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Association of California. Julia, we're so lucky to have your 20+ years of experience with us to lead us today, and I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Excellent. Wow, thank you so much, Chris. That was truly such a meaningful introduction for me. Thank you. And thank you to everyone at California Change Lawyers and all of you for joining today. As Chris said, my name is Julia. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a huge fan of California Change Lawyers, and I'm just so honored, and it's a personal joy to get to be a part of their work in this small way today, so thank you. So I think we're going to transition to the PowerPoint. There we go, fantastic. So that is where we are, and to the next slide, please. So my goal for the end of the day today is that, or our time together today, is that you will feel confident that public speaking is a set of learnable tactics, and that using those tactics will empower you to both claim speaking space with your unique and powerful presence, and to share your story in your voice with the world. And I want to pause here for a moment and acknowledge that I see the knowledge of public speaking tactics as a power that provides you with choice. And I say that acknowledging that the societal benchmark for public speaking, particularly for those of us in the legal profession in some way, that's held up is one that's based on a stereotypical identity of a straight, white, cisgender man. That because of the history of the legal profession, that is the standard that's often held up in law school and in other public speaking trainings. So I want to acknowledge that. I'm going to lay out a set of best practices and tactics today that are definitely informed by that, as well as by white dominant culture in our country. But I think knowing those allows those of us that might not match up exactly with that ideal to then make calculated and empowered choices about when we try to code switch to that ideal and when we use our authentic own voices in ways that may be countercultural or transformative. And so knowing those tactics allows us to make empowered choices about our presence, our voice, and our story. So that's my operating hypothesis for today. Next slide, please. My personal orientation to this topic is that I am white and I identify as a person with mental health conditions that are sometimes disabling. And I say that because my identity and my experience in this country and in our profession are informed first and foremost by my whiteness, and secondarily by my identification as a person with mental health conditions. And so there's all kinds of power and privilege in my life from the day I was born until this moment that has led to me being what I call a front of the room leader today. And I acknowledge and hold that power and that privilege. I also want to start by sharing a bit of my story, since this is partly about storytelling in our own voices. And I want to give a small trigger warning. It does involve references to addiction and cutting. So if that's something that's a trigger for you that you'd prefer not to hear, you can mute your volume or turn away for a moment. You can rejoin in about 2 minutes. So I'm 17 years old, sitting on an old metal rickety chair in the basement of a local church in a circle of around 10 strangers. And I'm the youngest person in the room by at least 20 years. I take a deep breath, and as my hands shake uncontrollably in front of me, I open my mouth to tell my story, my real story, for the first time in my life. Hello, my name is Julia, and I am an anorexic, bulimic, alcoholic, and addict. I'm sitting in that chair that afternoon at my first of many future 12-step meetings because my self-medicating behaviors have caught up with me. I've been secretly drinking, starving myself, and cutting since 8th grade, trying to blunt the impact of crushing depression and paralyzing anxiety attacks, the byproducts of my then undiagnosed mental health conditions. And I'm willing in that moment to tell my story for the first time because I know in my heart that I need to say it out loud in order to survive. Fast forward 15 years, I'm now 32 years old, and I'm sitting on another metal chair in a gray, drab, bureaucratic county conference room. I'm now a legal aid attorney, and I'm sitting side by side with my client, who is telling her story to an administrative law judge in a public benefits hearing. And I notice that her hands are clenched in her lap as she shares with the judge about the depths of her own depression and the waves of her anxiety, and how the county's so-called welfare to work program refused to accommodate her disabilities by counting her part-time enrollment in a community college as her work program. She goes on to win that hearing, and I know that there was such power in her telling her story in that setting, and I find myself wondering what it means that I'm still hiding my story from most of the people around me, managing to function as an attorney and as a new mom while struggling to find the medications that will help my brain rebalance its own chemistry. Jump forward another 18 years to last year. I'm now recently turned 50, and this time I'm standing in the front of a room before a group of foundation staff, and I'm about to convince them that their foundation should fund civil legal aid as a core strategy. I take a deep breath. I ground my feet. I open my mouth and I say, "Hi, I'm Julia. I self-identify as a person with mental health conditions that are sometimes disabling. I come to civil justice work first and foremost as a disability rights advocate. And by the end of our time together, I'm going to convince you all that law is an important tool to create rights, and that attorneys and advocates have a vital role to play in standing side by side with people as they claim and enforce those rights." And while my hands still shake a little as I sit down after the presentation with some leftover adrenaline, now I know that each time I tell my story, it's a celebration of the fact that my brain is and will always be slightly differently hardwired. And now I'm claiming my story, not to survive, but to thrive. So that's my story and how I tell it these days. Thank you for letting me share it with you. I'll come back to that to reference how I build those blocks later into the presentation. Next slide, please. So we're going to run a couple polls now so that we know more about you. And if we can bring up this first poll where the question is, how comfortable do you feel right now in your life speaking publicly? And you can see it's extremely comfortable, very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, not so comfortable, or really not at all. Go ahead and make your choice, and we'll leave this poll open for a bit. All right, and when we're ready, we can close that out and we'll share the results back with everyone so we can see.
Okay, so for the number one response was somewhat comfortable, 34% or 10 respondents. The number two response was not so comfortable, 7 folks or 24%. The next, very comfortable, 21% or 6 people. Extremely comfortable, 17% or 5, not at all, 1 respondent, 3%.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Okay, one more poll. How comfortable are you with telling your own story, right? So public speaking, but really not just on any topic, but where the topic is your story. Same choices. Great, and when ready, when it's done, we can share those back out as well.
Okay, so the top 2 vote getters are not so comfortable and very comfortable with 10 each. The next is somewhat comfortable, 6 respondents, extremely comfortable and not at all, 3 respondents each.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so we've got sort of a bell curve on both of those with very comfortable and not so comfortable in terms of your own story. Fantastic. So let's dig into the meat of the content today. Bit of a roadmap, if we can go to the next slide. I'm going to break these learnable public speaking tactics into 3 areas. First, in the planning, how do you structure your content? How do you think about it? The second, what's the use of visuals and some geography, by which I mean your body as one of the visuals. And then third is your presence, and how do you want to be with and show up when you're presenting? Next slide, please. A bit of a question for you, using the chat function, if you would. Think of a recent powerful or highly effective presentation that you observed, and just pull it up in your mind's eye and think, what made it powerful? What made it effective for you as an audience member? And just share some of your thoughts, 1 or 2 words, descriptors, adjectives, things that the person did that made it powerful and or effective. And we'll just let that run in the chat so we can all see it as a crowdsourcing of what makes for good presentations. Great, and while that's happening, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, moving into our first content, structuring. This is the planning side of public speaking. We can go right into the next slide. And there's basically an ABC approach. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. The first thing is to focus on your audience with specificity. Who's going to be there? Who's in the mix? Who's in the room? And don't ask yourself, what do I want to tell them? Or what do I want them to know? Ask yourself, what's my end goal? What do I want them to feel, think, or do at the end of my speaking time with them? And then say, okay, so given that end goal, what does this group need to know or hear at the end in order to achieve that goal? And then you prioritize based on who the audience is and what's likely to move them forward towards that direction and how much time you have. So audience centricity. B, streamline. Get your content down. Conciseness is key. Try to think about being short, tight, and to the point. Speakers that ramble do 2 things for audiences. First of all, they feel some empathetic anxiety, right? We all know what it's like to be up there and speaking. And so if you're rambling, their brains get triggered by that anxiety as if it was them that was going through it. And they also worry that you're going to go past your time and go long, which both amplifies that anxiety, and nobody likes it when things go long. So brevity, you want to get yourself concise. Last thing, come prepared. Particularly for me as a person with mental health conditions, if I walk in cold and I'm not prepared, it doesn't work for me. And the same is true for most speakers. So do the prep work, practice, build the memory in your body and your brain of having done it before. It will actually increase your comfort level when you're doing it. And practice to a shorter time frame. I usually recommend practicing to 90% of the time that you'll actually have, which gives you some room for audience reaction, for you to stumble a bit, for things to not get started exactly on time. So practice a 90% of the time container, and then come in with a script or note cards. I'll be transparent. This is what I use. I actually write out the things that I want to make sure I highlight. Do what works for you and keeps you on track in terms of timing. Next slide, please. Okay. When you are planning, there are 4 basic blocks in terms of content: focal point, opening, 2 to 3 key messages, no more, and then closing. So what's your focal point? Your focal point is the end goal that you hope that you will achieve with the audience by the end. You say it out loud, and you say it with them explicitly, and you say it at the beginning. It's actually the opposite of writing an argument, where you build your building blocks and then write your argument at the end. You take your argument and you put it at the beginning. It gives everyone a roadmap of where you're heading, and it primes the stage for what you're going to try to convince them of, what you want them to be feeling by the end, or the things that you want to know. With audiences, you have about 8 seconds where people make up their mind of whether they're going to listen to you or not. So by putting your focal point, that thing that you want them to be at by the end, in those first 8 seconds, you're more likely to get their buy-in, and then you get their attention throughout. The opening can either be your focal point if you don't have very much time. You can make them the same. If you have a little bit more time like we do today, the opening can be something that's a grabber for the audience's attention to try to move them past those 8 seconds. It can be a little story, an interesting fact or statistic, or best of all, best practice, something about them, like the polls that we ran, or raise your hand if you, right? Something to get the audience re-engaged with you during those 8 seconds. Okay, focal point opening, 2 to 3 key messages and no more. The human brain will really only retain 2, maybe 3 key points at the end of a presentation. So you have to prioritize your content. These key messages should be your conclusions. Again, if you were writing, they're the things that would be at the end of your paragraph, but you want to pull them and put them front at the top. You give the conclusion as the key message and then backed up with information. And organizing this way, especially when you're talking and folks might not necessarily be verbal processors, you give them the information, the bottom line of it, and then fill in some detail. You should also organize your PowerPoint slides in this same way. Then at the end, your closing is your focal point again. So you've opened with saying, by the end of our time, I think you'll be here, or I will have convinced you this, or you will know more about this. And you close off your container by coming back to the focal point as you're closing. The next slide, please, shows this built out a little bit more, right? Focal point opening, which can be the same if you have less time. Your key message, number 1, as its own statement, and then you fill in information. Key message number 2, 3, and then closing. And if you click one more slide, please, you'll see this is my structure for today. Right? My focal point was by the end, you'll know some knowable, learnable public speaking tactics that will give you the power to make choices about how you present and tell your story. The opening was my story and the polls. I have 3 key messages for you, and then I'm giving you additional information. And you'll hear at the end, I come back to the focal point again. Next slide, please. A bit about storytelling. So I'll just note that this could be a webinar on its own. So some key takeaways that I have learned in storytelling is to try to do things in the present tense. It can feel very awkward, but what you're trying to do is grab the audience's brains and pull them into a moment with you. And telling things as if you're sitting in the moment invites them in. So try it on. It can feel awkward. If it's too awkward for you, you still want them to take them into the moment and describe it as if you are experiencing it or watching it happen as you tell it. You're really looking to take the audience on a journey with you. small, vivid details can land people in that experience with you. And that experience is what matters, not necessarily the chronology or exactly what happened. That level of specificity also helps you fully re-engage in the memory or the experience, and that helps the listener also tap their own similar memories. So when I talk about a gray, bureaucratic conference room table, everyone has something that evokes in them, whether they've been in a room like that or not. If they have, then their memory comes up. If they haven't, then something about tables and bureaucracy will come up for them. You're relighting up the portions of their brain that will then empathize and resonate with your story. I find that in order to find these details, I have to write things out for myself with too much detail, and then I go back and I re-examine from an audience-centric standpoint, and I say, okay, does that detail matter to me, or does it matter to the audience? So like when I write my story out in that, as a 17-year-old in that church basement, I know that my mom was escorted out of the room gently by the leader of the program. That matters a lot to me in my context, but it doesn't matter in terms of the message that I'm trying to communicate to the audience, and so I cut it out. Actors often refer to something as called sense memory, meaning are there anchors of a memory that are so strong that they pull you as the person with the lived experience back into that moment. So for me, the feeling of sitting in a rickety metal chair brings me back to that 17-year-old self at my first 12-step meeting. It is absolutely evocative for me. So I use it. I put it in there because I know it puts me back in that emotional space in a way that allows me to access it. And I'll just note that these days, the TED Talks and TEDx Talks offer some really good models on storytelling because they use very similar building blocks with their speakers, but then you see how people layer their own unique voice, power, approach, lived experience on top of these similar approaches. Okay, next slide, please. All right, moving now to key message number 2. What do we mean in terms of visuals and geography? You've queued up your content. You know what your focal point opening, your 3 key messages, and your closing are going to be. Now you're planning the actual lived out part of public speaking. And so this is for me about 2 types of visuals: props and materials on one side, and then geography, meaning the use of your body and your body in space, because you are often the primary visual, unless it's an online thing like this, is the point where human beings can return to being in person together. You are the primary visual. Okay, next slide, please. If we're talking about PowerPoints, I want to note that PowerPoints can tank a presentation, like ruin it. And lawyers are pretty notoriously bad at this. Like if you've ever been to lawyer trainings where they try to fit the entire text of an entire statute on a PowerPoint slide, that's deadly. It's deadly for 2 reasons. First of all, everyone's trying to read the slide, and our brains actually can't listen and read very well at the same time. So whatever is coming out of your mouth in that moment is likely lost to the audience. Think about PowerPoints as a reinforcer or the icing on your cake, not the main course. The whole purpose of using PowerPoint is to keep visual learners engaged and processing, and to give everyone in the room a little bit of a roadmap around which your more comprehensive spoken piece is enveloped. PowerPoint should not be the handout, right? No one should be trying to read along. If you need a handout, you can have a separate PowerPoint that actually has a lot more text, and then use it as a handout, not as the thing that's displayed. Images and graphics are much better than text. Make sure you keep the whole design of it very simple, simple backgrounds, easy to read fonts consistent throughout, not too much size differential, and try for the 6x6 rule, which this slide in front of you adheres to. No more than 6 bullets, no more than 6 words per bullet. Okay, next slide, please. Visuals and geography, where to stand. So the first thing is that if you're in a country like the US, where people read most languages in our country from left to right, you want to make sure that you are always oriented to the audience's left of whatever screen or flip chart or other thing might be projected. That's because our eyes and brains are trained to look at the left side of something and then the right. And so the people, your audience's brains will be scanning you and then the visual, you and then the visual. You want them always to come back to you as the center point, and whatever flip chart or PowerPoint you have, which will be to your left and the audience's left. I think I did that right, throughout. So just think about that in terms of the where to stand. You know, and I'll note for myself, and I as a woman and as a person with disabilities, and I would have hypothesized for most folks who don't identify with or match that straight, white, cisgender male sort of benchmark, we're often told not to take up space. So this where to stand and where to put our bodies can trigger a lot of anxiety, imposter syndrome. And so the where we put ourselves physically can make a difference. There's a rule of thumb in public speaking to not stand behind the podium. And I would say that I have found that to cut two ways. The first is for me, because of the way my brain works, I need notes and I need somewhere to put those notes. I am a much better speaker when I'm behind a podium. It doesn't feel like hiding to me, although that's the benchmark, is that I'm hiding behind the podium. For me, it actually feels like that is a structure that I need to fully engage and bring my full self forward. So using a podium for me matters. It's not hiding. That's where an empowered choice can be made that allows me to fully show up. If you don't like a podium or aren't given a podium, then plot in advance the sense of where you want to be in terms of space. Do a little planning. When in your remarks do you want to move? When will movement add power to your story? Can you have a little bit of choreography? How close are you likely to be to the audience, and how is that going to matter to you? And do you want to move closer to them in some moments and move farther away from them in some moments? Don't drift on the stage for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. Claim your space. For those of us who are told not to take up space, that is a moment of reclaiming power. And what does that mean? When I think about that, it's my physical stance while I'm speaking. I think of tall and forward. I keep my feet pointed towards the audience, and I think about my heart space being open and broad and also aimed at the audience. I keep my weight on the balls of my feet so that I am inviting myself into the space with them. If I allow myself to rock back on my heels and close my body off and turn away, I am signaling not only to the audience, but to myself that I am needing to protect myself, that I don't want to engage, and that there's something risky or scary going on. So I practice opening up myself, getting in my body, and leaning in and towards the audience. That allows me also to make eye contact with the room so that I am inviting that kind of emotional connectivity. I want the nervous systems of the people in the room to be co-regulating with my nervous system. If I'm telling a point of a story that's sad, I want to be inviting them into that emotion. If I'm telling them something that I think is provokes anger and is a call to action, I want their nervous system to be resonating with mine. That means I need to be communicating with them and making eye contact with them. Gestures. You can tell by now that I talk with my hands. Again, the benchmark in public speaking, and during law school, people told me that I needed to speak by holding onto the sides of the podium because my hand movements were distracting. So I learned to speak while clenching onto the podium. And I can tell you that what that did for me is it sent myself a message that I was uncomfortable, that I was at risk, and that something dangerous was going on. And so, again, knowledge of the benchmarks will allow us to make empowered choices. I have, as an adult speaker, allowed myself to release my hands. And I think about this in two ways. I create a visual field that for me is where the story is taking place. I don't want my hand gestures to be distracting. I want them to be additive. So it's something that I often practice. And so I make sure that the way that I'm sketching out the story in front of myself with my hands is something that I am intentionally sharing with the audience. The one thing that I never do is point at an audience unless it is a very clear call to action that I am extending to them, because otherwise pointing in our society can make people feel uncomfortable. Okay, next slide, please. Your presence, the last of our key messages for today. You are the vehicle for your story. Your physical presence, your body and your voice are a tool, are the mechanics that you have available to you. Next slide, please. So a moment about what we mean by presence, because I want to distinguish what I'm talking about from what people sometimes refer to as executive presence in business school, which I worry has come to mean a white, straight, cisgendered male executive, and the way that those people who identify that way might stereotypically show up in that environment. That is not what I'm talking about today. What I mean by presence is your most authentic, wise, inner leader, commanding, compassionate, magnificent self, which includes being in your body, centered, grounded, and fully self-aware and here in this moment and able to tell your story from that spot. So if we use that definition of presence, meaning present in this moment, what might get in the way of you being able to fully access and utilize your unique presence when you're speaking and telling your story? Next slide, please. What happens in our brain chemistry? I want to pause here and just note, I love this. This is from AOC's Instagram account. She did a while ago when she was speaking overseas, a beautiful little breakdown of her speech writing and preparation for public speaking. And I just love this because she was so upfront about acknowledging about how nervous she still gets every time she has to speak publicly. It felt like such permission for those of us who adore her to realize, yeah, being nervous when you're going to speak is totally normal, especially when the stakes are high. So what happens in your brain when you're about to speak publicly, right? Your brain is trained to identify risk and danger. And that's both true when you're actually physically, like a mountain lion, or when your ego perceives possible risk, meaning like being hurt or vulnerable. And so the body releases a pair of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And adrenaline is the thing that prepares your body to fight or flight or freeze or please, right, to get out of the danger. And cortisol is actually the thing that assists in the metabolism of carbohydrates. Like, it's literally going to fire you up to respond. Now, the problem with these in terms of public speaking and telling your story is that they can flood your brain. And that's what actually leads to a set of uncomfortable body sensations that we call stage fright, right? Shortness of breath, getting sweaty, feeling your heart pound more quickly, feeling a little bit of sick to your stomach, hot or flushed or shaky voice or hands. That's all from being flooded in your brain with these stress hormones. And they actually shut down the parts of your brain that allow you to make purposeful choices, right? So your brain is flooded, you're not functioning as well, you have to bring everything back online. And it's just so human, right? As AOC's own posts prove, it's human. It happens to all of us. So what do we do about it? Okay, next slide, please. If that's the reality of what's going to happen to your brain, here are some public speaking hacks to know this is going to happen and mitigate it. The first is get grounded in your body, right? Make sure that while you're speaking and practicing, that you create a constant biofeedback loop with your body and awareness, and to keep that going while you're speaking. So my trick is when I'm speaking, and I'm doing it right now, I make sure that I can feel my feet. And when it's really bad, I make sure that I can try to feel every toe as a distinct toe. And if I'm speaking and I realize that I've lost track of where my feet are, I know that I'm pulling out of my body and I'm getting pushed up into that place out of fear. So I need to take a breath, reconnect with my feet while speaking, and making sure that I have this constant flow of biofeedback. Where are my feet? What's going on? Am I fully present and grounded? Same thing with breathing. Making sure that you pause and take breath, and that you're doing that. You can even build it in for yourself. I know folks who make little hash marks in the written part of their text that shows them where to breathe. Taking power poses. So I won't go into the details, but there's this wonderful research by a woman named Amy Cuddy, and she has a book and a TED Talks on this that shows that taking verbal signals to your body that you are powerful and allowed to take up space. So there's this pose you can see there, and there's the one that the media has called the Wonder Woman pose. This actually signals to your brain and reduces the amount of cortisol that's in your brain. So if you can go to the bathroom before you speak, hit one of these poses for 2 minutes, you are adjusting the biochemistry in your brain before you go on stage. I talked about using the room and the purposeful and choreography. That can also be a grounding thing for your body. If it has this memory during your practice, now I walk here, at this moment I stand here, you're continuing to ground yourself in the physicality of your presentation and getting out of that flooded brain space. A little bit about voice, and I hesitate here because a lot of what's in the normal legal profession coaching around voice is aimed at women. And the fact that our voices, many of us, have a different tonality than male voices. So I'm not suggesting here that the thing that women should do is try to sound more like men. The reality is that when we tense up as women and tense the muscles in our throat, and particularly around our vocal cords, our voices can get higher. I'm noticing that mine's doing it right now, actually. And so what I try to do with my breath and my body awareness is think about my voice coming more from my chest. That allows the muscles in my throat to relax, the muscles around my vocal cords relax, and my voice will drop a little bit more deeply. It often also prevents me from ending my sentences on an upswing like they're a question, and instead keeps me in a place where I'm making declarative statements because I'm coming from a more centered, grounded place. Rather than me trying to sound more like a man, it's about me making sure that I have my body sensations in a place where I'm feeling really in command and centered in my own physical space. Last thing about cadence, if you want, oh, yes, absolutely. If you have an opportunity to watch Judge Felton Henderson speak, he is the master of using a pause. And if you watch him, he prints out his speeches, and you can see he runs his hand along the text where he is. And he will take moments where he just doesn't speak, and where he sort of collects himself, makes sure he knows where he is, and then proceeds. And it's so powerful. It makes him riveting. And any of us who feel like we've been told that we aren't supposed to be in these spaces, or that our story doesn't matter, or we're not supposed to be the people who claim time and space, taking a moment to take a pause can really both give us a moment to make sure we can feel our feet and get into the power of that moment. So think about your cadence. It's okay to speak slowly, claim that time, and pause. One more slide, and then I'm basically done. Afterwards, this just means that know when you step down from speaking, especially if you're telling your story and your story is powerful or countercultural in some way, or is owning something about yourself, that adrenaline and cortisol are still going to be in your brain. Give yourself some self-compassion. We all have these moments of what Brené Brown calls a vulnerability hangover when we've opened up and shared something. And we just need to know that that's okay, it's human. You can actually give yourself a short burst of oxytocin, which is the brain's antidote to cortisol, by putting both of your hands on your heart space and just pressing a little bit and giving yourself a positive affirmation like, good job, or hey, I like you. And it's shown that doing that, that little bit of self-compassion and love releases that oxytocin in your brain, which can tamp down the cortisol. Last slide, please. Two other things that I have done in my practice of public speaking is I found role models who speak with voices that let me think outside that white male cisgender benchmark and find and try on different ways of being. So these are all the links that are coming out. These wonderful speakers, I recommend these 6 to you, and you can find them in the links in the chat. And just experiment. Let your brain take in and absorb the way that different speakers speak, and see, and then try it on. See what works for you. Okay, last slide. Oh, I would say the other thing is to find a practice group. I have an amazing group, diverse group of women who are my go-to people. When I have to do something in terms of public speaking, I go and do it in front of them, and they give me badass, absolutely matter-of-fact, loving, compassionate feedback. So build your group that you can practice with. Last thing, totally transparent, coming back to my focal point, I hope that now you are feeling confident that public speaking and telling your story is a set of learnable tactics that allow you to make empowered choices about how you share your authentic, powerful presence and your unique story with the world. And I'll just add here that particularly in these challenging times, I know that each and every one of you are magnificent and that your story is exactly what the world needs to hear. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Oh, yes.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, adult learning shows that the adult brain does better in terms of holding on to content if you can name in the moment one key takeaway, something that you'll apply, something that you'll hold on to. If you just share those in the chat, it makes it more likely than that a month from now when you have your next public speaking opportunity, you'll have this moment of like, oh, that was my takeaway. So everybody can share those in the chat now.
Julia, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview on public speaking skills. We have a number of questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The first one I wanted to pose to you was raised a little bit early in your presentation, but about actually telling your story. Do you have tips on how you tell your story versus I guess the skills and tactics, but kind of evoking what might resonate with an audience member that's drawn from your own experience? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, that's great. So I'll say I always try to make sure that whatever piece of my lived experience I'm sharing is really tied to the end result that I'm trying to evoke in the audience, right? So it's still about the back and forth of information sharing and the resonance that I'm trying to create in the audience. And then I actually draw on some acting experience, which is I sit down and I write it as if I'm telling the story, and I just write out all the details, and then I practice telling it to people that in my circles, like I'm like, can I try telling you this story? And then I see from watching them what resonates with them and what doesn't resonate. And then I go back through, like I said, and I do that sort of ruthless editing of the details that I know land me in the story and matter to me, but aren't tied necessarily to that end state I'm trying to evoke in the audience. So I'd say it's sort of a 3-part story. The other thing I would note, which I didn't say, is there are stories that I tell that I have to tell to myself and my loved ones multiple times to be able to tell them publicly. Like my 17-year-old self, the first times I told that story out loud to anyone else, I cry. Like, it's very emotional. It's even now in my 50s, that time period holds a lot of emotion for me. I wouldn't want to tell that story for the first time publicly without having sort of released some of that emotional content around it and gotten it to a place where I'm like, oh, this is a reliable story I can tell now. I can access the emotion when I want to without it overtaking me in the moment.
Excellent, thank you. What about when you're afraid to say the wrong thing? Any pointers on that?
That's great. Afraid to say the wrong thing. I think that, well, I mean, I should say, I come from a standpoint that as long as you are communicating from your authentic self, where your intent is to move another group of people in a direction that matters to you, that two things are possible. You can communicate from your perspective, understanding that it's your perspective and not necessarily theirs. And if something lands awkwardly with someone, that you can clean it up. So I guess I'm assuming that everyone's coming from an intention of moving a group of people or building a shared experience. And that as long as you're willing to hear from someone that it didn't land well with them and be in that conversation with them, that it's hard to imagine what the wrong thing would be. Like, look, if you're concerned about the wrong thing and it's hurtful or painful or something else to the other people, then I would really vet that with someone, because what's the purpose then? But as long as your purpose is to build a shared understanding or move a group of people, and you're willing to hear that it lands in a rough way and engage in that conversation, I think you can't go wrong. Does that help, Chris? Does that feel on target?
Yes, thank you. The next question is, how do we find public speaking opportunities to actually hone our skills? Or do we focus more on practicing so when the moment arises, we're actually ready?
Yes, and be practicing. That's so great. Like, build your practice group now, and like my practice group, we get together twice a year and just practice whatever we're working on about that we want to be able to communicate about, even if we don't have an opportunity in front of us. The practicing builds a whole muscle set. In terms of opportunities, raise your hand. Put it out there in your social and professional circles that you are looking for opportunities, because there are many, many groups that are looking for people to come in and speak publicly on different topics. And if you start to manifest that you're looking for those opportunities, they will come their way. Put it on your LinkedIn page, right? Start telling people, I'm looking for ways to build my public speaking skills, and I promise you that opportunities will show up.
The next question, what do you think is the best way to give your boss, the ED or the CEO, feedback as a public speaker?
As them public speaking?
Yes.
Wow, that's a great question. Well, let me preface this by saying they have to be open to a certain amount of feedback to begin with, right? Like, it takes a certain opening. Wow, that's a really interesting question. And then there's power dynamics, just to name that too, right? There's going to be power dynamics within an organization. And the person, having been a CEO, there's also some vulnerability from the CEO. I would say something like, hey, I'm curious about whether you're open, because curiosity is a wonderful perspective to come from in opening any feedback conversation. I'm curious about whether you're open to some feedback about how you might take your public speaking to the next level. I love that phrase, the next level, because it assumes that someone's already functioning well, but who doesn't want to take everything they can do to the next level? It's kind of an innocuous way of saying there's a little more something that you could do. So I would start there, and then I would have the more observable behavior that you can reference. So you're not saying you aren't good at something, but like, you could choreograph this differently, or you could use your hands differently, or you could make more eye contact. Like, the observable behaviors as if they're stage directions makes it much easier for people to accept feedback about their public speaking.
Yes, excellent. And then this is the last question that we have time for. It says, sorry if this is beyond the scope, But what if
Mm.
you don't have prepared remarks? Any suggestions then?
Oof. Yep. I mean, I hate those. For someone with like my mental health conditions, that is a recipe for disaster. It's like my least favorite thing. So for me, it is most important in those moments that I get super grounded in my body before I open my mouth. Because if I open my mouth in that moment, all that's speaking is the adrenaline cortisol. I'll speak a mile a minute and I won't remember to breathe. So I get my feet super grounded. I tell myself that I'm going to say about 5 sentences and then pause. I let those 5 sentences come out and then I make sure I pause so that I'm getting myself the space to read. Because otherwise, I mean, I'm an oral processor and anxious. I'll talk for 15 minutes and say nothing in those moments.
Well, thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry that's all the time that we have for today. Julia, thank you so much for offering your wisdom and your tips on being an effective public speaker. It's an essential skill that we believe all legal change makers should have, and we really are grateful for the time that you've spent with us today. I just want to close on a couple administrative notes. Our next webinar will be on April 16th at noon on confronting microaggressions. It'll be conducted by Karen Fleshman, who's the founder of Racy Conversations, and herself, she's an attorney. Please join us for this training on April 16th. We also have next Tuesday, like I mentioned, social justice lawyering in the age of COVID-19. And then as soon as this webinar ends, you'll receive a SurveyMonkey evaluation. So please tell us what you liked and what you didn't like and what we might be able to improve or do in the future. And thank you again. We've reached the end of our time together for this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Please all stay safe and be strong with community. Thank you.